Now I'll go to the next step of this 5-step framework about policy outreach and advocacy for public-private dialogue, and we call this step the designing step. And here we want to develop a message. We want to develop a message because we've done a bit of stakeholder mapping and targeting, and we want now to try to understand what's kind of the competition point of view, the people who are against that particular reform, what do they think and what do they say, and why do they think like that? And so we also want to really understand in that step what people are thinking today, and we can use surveys, polls, just talk to people to try to get a better picture of the situation. So in order to do that, we have to think about how to develop a message about the issue we want to bring about. So let's say you're working on an issue about education. And this is about putting more teachers in the classrooms. Okay, so you're working in the educational sector, and it's a skills development reform, and you need more teachers in primary education classrooms. That's the issue, because that's what your dialogue process is all about. Or that's one of the reforms that your dialogue process is tackling right now. Well, there are several levels in the message. So the first level is to talk about the attributes of that issue. For instance, you could say, this is about putting more teachers in the classroom. Or you could say, classrooms today have so many kids per teachers, and we want to increase that a little bit. This is what it's all about. There will be that many more teachers coming into the education marketplace, and that's what they're going to do. There'll be more per classroom. So that's the attribute of the issue. This is the equivalent of describing a car by saying these are 4 wheels, and it goes, these are how many miles per gallon you get, and or liter per kilometer per liter, and this is a kind of safety you have. So you talk about the attributes of the thing. Now, one thing you could do one step further and talk about the benefits. The benefits. So for instance, you can say, if there are more teachers per kids, the kids will have a better content delivery, they'll have a better education, because they will pay, there will be more teachers, so more teachers for less kids, they will be able to cater to those classrooms better. And eventually it's going to result in the kids learning more and in a better way, and in a more quiet way. And you can also say for the car that the car is going to bring you, it's going to be a fast car, it's great for the city, there are good benefits for this. So you can really talk about the benefits of the issue. First you talked about the attributes, and then you talk about the benefits for the issue, but that's kind of not enough for me to act. Because there are many things with many benefits, and it's hard for me to decide between 2 different options just based on the benefits, because I have to weigh those benefits. So I really have to understand the personal consequences for me. What are the personal consequences of making a decision to support this, and what's the message that's going to call to the personal consequences for me? So in the case of education reform, again, the personal consequences for you is that if your kids have more teacher per classrooms, the attribute, and if they, because of it, they will learn better, which is a benefit, then they will have a better job, you will have less to support them, they'll be less unemployed later, when you'll be able to retire happier, and you won't have to even support them when you're in retirement, they'll support you. This is all good for you, because your children will actually, go out in the world more equipped and be more successful, and that's a personal consequence to you. And if you are selling a car, you will say, well, this car is great for you because, when you haul away things, you can do more home renovation for you because you'll be able to bring stuff on the back of your truck, or you'll be able to go shopping and bring more kids into the car, and you'll be able to bring them to many places, and they'll have a lot of benefits from that because they'll have more activities and more fun with a lot of friends and all that stuff. So you're calling to the personal consequences. And that's very important, because if I don't understand the personal consequence, and that means every individual needs to understand the personal consequence to supporting or not supporting something. Every time you do a purchasing decision, you do the same thing. You evaluate, you do a cost-benefit analysis between the cost of something and the personal benefit you will get out of that object that you buy or that service that you buy. And it's a very similar process when you're doing policy advocacy. People, whether they support or not something, it's because of the personal consequences they have. And although people have the greater good that they're thinking about, they're also thinking about their personal consequences. But let me tell you something, that's not enough. Just selling on the attributes, on the benefits, and on the personal consequences still sometimes is not enough to tip the scale. So when you develop a message, you not only have to put the attributes, the benefits, and the consequences, but you have to go one last step, which is about the values. Because values are universal, and they call up to the things that are really, really deep inside you. So how will you do that for this education reform that we talked about? More kids in the classroom. What's the values behind that? Well, we said more kids in the classroom, better attention span from the kids who bloom better into the marketplace and find some good jobs, and it's good for you to be able not to have to take care of that later on. But really, if you support that reform, it's because you're a good parent. And that's the value I'm calling into. Support this education reform and I'll make you a good parent. You might know about a reform that was passed in the US a few years ago, and it's called the No Child Left Behind Bill. And this is a complicated education reform about scoring and a lot of things. And if I recall well, the Republican passed it. And they called it the No Child Left Behind Bill. What a fantastic name. I don't know of a better name. This is like, are you really about leaving a kid behind? No, of course not. So they're calling up to the values right in the title. And the title of that reform is a fantastic message by itself. Let alone that this reform you might be against or for it, and if you were to look at the attributes of the reform, actually a lot of people, they don't look into the attribute of the reform. The reform is too complicated. So they'll support it based on the message and the values as opposed to support it on the attributes. That's how human beings are. And so the values, when you recall all those pictures I showed earlier about the Coca-Cola and the value of having fun, the not drinking and the value of saving a life, the watch with the James Bond picture right there, these were calling up to the values of people. And that's what you have to think about when you develop a message. Now, what's important is that people have different opinions and people have different values. This is a poll that was done in Bangladesh about what should be the reasons why the government of Bangladesh should carry on this drive to put things in a digital way and do what we call e-government. Should the government keep doing that or not? And what are the implications for citizens and so on? And if you look at this poll, it's so interesting because you will find like very different reasons for different people. And the reason is people have different personal consequences personal view on their benefits, different values. The first reason why the government people are interested, which is a blue line, is to increase government efficiency. But it's only 15%, half of that, of the general population who cares about it. They care about something completely the opposite picture. The green line on top, they want to create a digital Bangladesh. They want to be proud of being in a digital Bangladesh. And this sense of pride, which is very intangible for them, is more important than some of the other personal consequences for the people in the government, because they want efficiency. And so, whereas only 17% of the government thinks, we should do it for creating a digital Bangladesh, that's what the general population thinks. And you find very, very different things. Like at the bottom of this graph, you have, we should do that because we should strengthen the information and technology sector. And the government thinks yes. And even the private sector, the opinion leaders, yes, 23%. But look at the general population. Look at the business owners. They don't care about that. They don't see it the same way. Now, we're talking about something that will be the same effort, the same type of reform, but people see it very differently. So it's very important to understand that and to understand this issue of values and all this. Now, when you develop a message, you need to develop this message thinking not only about what you're saying about yourself, why this reform is good, but you got to be ready about the people who are against it. You remember the people who are against it? We're going to call it them in this graph. We're going to say that the people who are for this reform are us. And what do we say about promoting this? But there is another camp somewhere who is lurking in the dark. And we're saying, we don't want that custom reform to happen. We don't want that education reform to happen that way. We don't want that tax system reform to happen this way. We want something different. And it's not that those people are bad guys. It's just that they have a different opinion. And because they have a different opinion, they also have a message about the way they conceive their opinion and why they are doing it and how they're communicating about it. This is a message box. And this message box, another tool that was handed over to us by Steve Rabinowitz, this message box is great because you can put here information about not only about yourself. What do you say about yourself? What do we say about ourselves? Why is our reform good? Why should you do this thing? We have a banking reform to do and on SME banking and try to push the banks to do a little bit more microfinance, for instance, and you want to communicate to the banks. And what do we say about ourselves? We're saying, well, it's good because you will be able to eventually upgrade the number of customers. It's good for the country. A lot of things we can say. But what do we say about the opponents? We say, well, they don't understand the banking sector today. If you look at the other countries, this is how they're doing it. And they're a proponent of the past, we're a proponent of the future, because we've seen best practice. We're only trying to implement best practice for our country, and we've proven it with such and such data. So this is what you say about yourself and what you say about the other camp, in a way. Now, if you go to the other camp, you have to try to think and try to analyze what are they saying, what are the messages that you hear. You hear about yourself, those people don't understand the way this country works. Our country is different from other country. We don't have, there are other people that can do microfinance, not the banks, for instance. So they might have a different messaging, which is about the effort that you're trying to run. What are they saying? And what are they saying about themselves? How do they define themselves and how do they define you? Because in a relationship and when you're in contention with people, you define yourself, you define the other defines himself or herself and defines you. And you got to write down all those messages. So what I'd like you to do is another exercise. If you take the reform that in part 1 we took and you were doing this stakeholder map about it, can you take the same reform and do a practical exercise where you write a statement in each of the square of this message box. And you're going to write an actual statement with sentences that you hear you saying when you promote this idea, or that you hear others say about this, about themselves or about you, and you're going to write about yourself and about them. And so take a few minutes and try to do that, because that's going to be a very important component that's going to complement the first step to design the messages that you're going to have about the reform and how you're going to communicate about it. Take a few moments. Right below under this video, you'll find a file, which is a message box. You can take it and work with it. Next, remember, when we saw those pictures, you had one single message. When we saw those pictures of the watch with James Bond, it's one picture. You don't see 7 pictures. One about this watch, one about the other watches that you haven't bought or that they don't want you to buy. No, you see a single message. In politics, it's the same thing. You see a single message and you got to pound that message. But this message has to do a lot of things. It's got to do 10 things. 10 C's of advocacy messaging. It has to be concise. If it's a long, complicated thing, nobody will remember it. Everybody needs to remember it. It has to be compelling and convincing. You have to be convinced. When you hear that message, you have to be convinced about this idea. This is something good to do. It has to be credible. You can't lie. And it's credible because it sometimes comes from specific people. It has to be character defining. That's the value thing. When you hear this, you have to feel that by adopting this, your character is defined in a certain way. It calls up to your value. It has to be contrasting, and that's very important in relation to the message box we just did a minute ago. It has to be contrasting with the opponents, with the other side. It has to be different. It has to be contextual. You have to remind people where you are. In the context of the country today with high unemployment, it's quite essential that we provide employment to the youth, because we have 27.5% of unemployment in the youth population today in this particular country, and so on. So it has to be contextual. It has to be well communicated. It has to be well written. It has to be snappy and well conveyed by people as well. It's got to be consistent and constant. Consistent meaning that when several stakeholders will take that message, it has to be the same all the time. And when you're in a public-private dialogue and you have different people involved in it, in a working group, for instance, and you're promoting something, once you've defined a reform and the reform proposal is there on the table, and a lot of economists have worked on it, and lawyers, and now you have a proposal which is very sound, the way you're going to communicate about that reform should be really consistent. That means everybody needs to say the same thing about it, because if people start to say different things, it's going to create a confusing message. And you want to pound the same thing again and again, so people should learn those lines by heart in a way, so that whenever they meet someone, that they can influence, they repeat the same message, and it becomes consistent. It's also constant, because constant means all the time. Because the more you say something, the more people are going to get it. The more exposed they are in various mediums, in various walks of life. If they saw something on TV and then they go to a meal and there is someone in the meal that talks about it and use the same kind of terms to talk about the issue, it reinforces the message. So whatever the settings you're using to communicate, it has to be consistent and it has to be constant. So these are the 10 C's of messaging. And it's very hard to define a message, because imagine that you're dealing with 10 different reform proposals, 10 different actions you want to do in a cluster. You're going to have to define those with all those 10 C's for each of those. So this is taking into practice, the 10 C's of messaging, and putting them into practice to one single message about what's a good messaging, what's a good advocacy message. where we could say it's a discrete amount of information founded in empirical research and in the times, and drawing a distinction from others, communicated effectively to a narrow group of stakeholders who have not yet made up their minds. So this is what's a good message. It's very hard to do a message like this, but you have to try. And so that's what you're going to do now. You're going to select the same reform for the same country or sector or localization where you were before. And you're going to write the message that will help you promote this idea successfully. Okay? Think about, you're only going to talk about a discrete amount of information founded in empirical research with numbers and in the times, that is a context, drawing a distinction from the others with a contrast, communicated effectively, well conveyed, to a narrow group of stakeholders who have not yet made up their mind. And the group of stakeholders you're communicating, they're the ones who are, remember in the first matrix we did, they have not yet made up their mind. Will they stick their neck out, or will they be for you and against, or against you if anyway they're going to stick their neck out? So take a few minutes and try to write this message. Again, you will find the file below the video where you can download it and write that down. Now I want to come up about this messaging to tell you a little bit about social marketing. And that's a process it's a tool that can be very useful when you're thinking about how behavior change occurs. How does behavior change takes place? Well, it takes place in stages, because you just wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to support this. It's a process. It's a process that has 4 basic stages. One is pre-contemplation. You don't even know that this issue exists and you could support it. So you're in pre-contemplation mode. For instance, if you're talking about the health problem, and you're saying you want people to stop smoking, before, people might not even know that it's bad to smoke. And they don't even consider the idea of stopping to smoke. Or people who drink a lot of alcohol and they don't realize it, and they don't even, they're in pre-contemplation. Then eventually someone says, or an agency says through an ad, or the government says, or a friend says, you know what, smoking is bad for you. You should kind of maybe stop, because it's going to create a lot of problem for your lungs, and you're putting your life at risk, and it's not great. So then the person's going to be in the contemplation mode. Well, I got some information about it. Let me think about it. If they decide to do something, they prepare to do it, and they do the action. They do the action to say, no, I'm going to stop smoking. I decided to. But once they've done it, they have to maintain this action of stopping to smoke all the time, because every time there is a cigarette passing, they say, oh, maybe I should smoke again. Now, when you're in a political setting, people decide to support something and to put their political backing behind a particular reform. They might not know about this issue before. They might not know about the fact that the customs system was inefficient and was causing a lot of traders not to export their goods, because the goods will rot in customs because it took too long to clear the containers. And that if there is a new system put in place for automated, scanning of container, for instance, or a different type of inspection, it's going to go faster. Maybe someone who is in a political decision maker did not know that particular information, so he was in pre-contemplation. But then there is information that comes to that person, and suddenly comes in contemplation. Should we do something about it? If they decide to do something about it, they're going to have to decide to do it and to maintain this favorable opinion of this program over time as it gets into a lot of implementation hurdles. So we have a very similar process here. And people think about what's the benefit for me to get involved when they're in contemplation stage, what's the costs of doing this, and the cost can be a lot of things. What's the role of others in this thing? Is it just me deciding, or is it others telling me to do something? And the influence of others is very important. We call it peer pressure. We call it admiration for certain people who will have an opinion. That's why you see a lot of advertising companies using celebrities, because if a celebrity endorses a product, you feel more confident to use that product. You contemplate using that product because of the importance of others, or the others can be the people around you and the effect that it will have on them. And is there a self-efficacy, meaning that if you do it, it will be good for you. If you do it, you will get more voters. If you do it, you will get more healthy. And that's kind of part of the personal benefit. So it's kind of another framework I'm talking to you about here that we talked about before, but it's on the same idea. And I want to take a few examples. So, because your message that you're developing need to demonstrate that there is a benefit that offsets the cost. And if you think about a Pepsi Cola, the cost of a Pepsi Cola is what? Let's say £1, $1, €1. That's a can of Pepsi. I talk about Pepsi because I talked about Coke before. So here, what do you get? You get something that's going to quench your thirst, meaning you won't be thirsty anymore. That's a self-efficacy. That's what you wanted at the beginning, right? But it also tastes good. That's not bad. But what you feel you're getting is you're getting the sense of fun, you're getting a feeling of youth, you're hanging out with your friends. That's all the values that Pepsi Cola put into the Pepsi Cola. So when you spend the €1, the $1, the £1, or the one whatever, when you spend that money, what you're buying is all those benefits. And they manage to put this into you because they understand how your marketing mind works. And they bring you from pre-contemplation to contemplation, and the action is the reward you get, is all that. Now think about condoms, for instance. You know that condoms are good because they reduce sexually transmitted disease, and it's good to against pregnancy. It's a great control mechanism. So how much does that cost? Well, it costs maybe £0.25 for one condom, $0.25, €1.25. What's another cost you have? It's pretty embarrassing when you have to put it on in front of your girlfriend or something, and it's not, doesn't feel as good. Well, but what do you get for it? Why do people, actually still use condoms? It's embarrassing, you lose pleasure, it's not great, so why? Well, because you get protection against pregnancy, and that's a great benefit. Protection against sexually transmitted disease, great benefit. Peace of mind, you give peace of mind to your partner, and that's very strong benefit for you. Then you might get a sense of control, hope for the future, because you won't get, any sexually transmitted disease. So if you put a condom on, then you know that, you have a more likely, you won't catch AIDS or any other thing like that. So there is hope for the future, and you might get a date. You might not get it without the condom that you have in your pocket. So what I'm saying here is that there is an offset between the cost and the benefits, and sometimes it seems that something is so awful and costly, but the benefits are much greater. You see it as well about vaccination and immunization. It's a big deal. You have to, immunize people. But what's the cost? Money, time, and really, people don't like the needle. That's why they don't do it. But what do you get for all that? If you buy the immunization, the vaccine, if you take the time to go to the doctor to get it, you might have to pay the doctor. Sometimes it's free. and you get the needle. When I was a kid, I used to run around the table, and the doctor was chasing me because he wanted to put the needle, and I said, like, no needle, I hate needles. But why do you eventually do it? Because if you do it, you get better health. You avoid a much greater discomfort, like the flu, for instance. And for instance, you might get the ability to travel. I travel a lot to countries where I need to bring in immunization cards. If I don't have that cards, I don't have the right to travel to those countries because I'm not immunized for, let's say, yellow fever or something like this. So it's self-efficacy. All those things go into the behavior, why you adopt a behavior, why you decide to go into action. It's the very same when you're talking about the reform, when you're talking about policy. Because there is a lot of cost into someone supporting a policy. I have to use my political capital. I don't have a lot of political capital. Maybe I was just elected. Maybe I have an election coming. But I have some amount of political capital, and that's finite. I can't extend it. So if I use a chunk for this, it's costly to me. It's also time. I got to get involved into this thing. I got to read about it. I got to show up at events. I got to go and talk about it. I could talk about something else. It might cost me some of my political base because my political base is not completely homogeneous. There are people from various walks of life that supported me because of this thing that I promoted, but they have different opinions. And when it got to this particular issue, I'm going to defend it, but it won't be pleasing to them. So I got to understand that this is a huge cost to me. I'm going to lose some of my political base maybe. And I'm going to get a headache. Why do I want to do this? I was happy without it. This is all cost. But what do I get? I get here, for instance, an economic reform, a better business environment. That's a benefit. I might get new partisans that's going to vote for me. That's self-efficacy. Good self-media, media clippings. That's going to say, this guy is great, great support. It's very efficient for me. Might get re-elected. International context, you might say, I'm going to support this big reform because all the international community really wants me to do it. I'm going to do it, and I'll deal away with them. That's another self-efficacy. There's many things you can think of, and you might even get, the ability to get invited at conference, and and show all the good work you have done. You don't know. I'm just putting a very partial list here, and it's a bit cynical one. But just want to give you a sense that when someone takes a decision, you take someone from pre-contemplation to contemplation to eventually going into action and maintaining this action, you're going to have to reiterate all the time the benefits to this person, and they have to be pretty clear. And so in a way, a public-private dialogue devises a reform proposal and pushes the reform proposal or pushes the action to make sure everybody does what they need to do. These benefits needs to be clear to people at all time.